Look through the metallic eye of the future and see a world where every choice has a cinematic consequence. We explore the intersection of human destiny and the cold precision of fate in every frame. Hit subscribe now and change the way you see the world.
I was standing at the kitchen sink rinsing my coffee mug when my phone buzzed on the counter. I almost didn't pick it up. I had 17 unread emails, a deposition to prep for, and a Sunday that was already slipping away from me faster than I could drink my second cup. I figured it was my brother reminding me about the dinner. He'd been texting all week, casual stuff. Nothing that set off any alarms. Just excited energy, he said. A family catch-up. It had been months since we'd all been in the same room. But the name on the screen wasn't my brother's. It was Harriet. Harriet, who had been our family's estate attorney for going on 22 years. Harriet, who sent birthday cards with handwritten notes and never once called on a Sunday. Ever. The text read, "Do not go to that dinner tonight. I need you to call me right now. I mean it, Jess. Right now." I set the mug down. The water was still running. I didn't move to turn it off. She picked up before I even heard it ring on my end. "Jessica." Her voice was not the warm, unhurried voice of the woman who had walked me through my mother's estate paperwork 3 years ago. It was clipped, urgent, the way a doctor sounds when they pull you aside in a hallway. "Are you home right now? Are you alone?" I said yes to both. "Good. Lock your door. I'm already in the car. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Do not call your brother. Do not text anyone in your family until I get there." I stood in my kitchen with my phone pressed against my ear long after she'd hung up. The faucet was still running. I watched the water spiral down the drain and tried to slow my heartbeat down to something manageable. Harriet arrived in 19 minutes. She had a canvas tote over one shoulder that she held the way you'd hold a live grenade, carefully close to her body, like she didn't trust it to anyone else. She came inside without taking her coat off, dropped the bag on my dining table, looked at me like she was calculating exactly how much I could handle. "Before I show you this," she said, "I need you to hear me say something first. You are not losing your mind. Everything you've been doubting about yourself for the past 8 months, it wasn't you, okay? It was not you." I didn't know yet what she meant, but something in my chest cracked open anyway, because I had been doubting myself, quietly, constantly. The kind of self-erosion that happens so gradually you can't point to the moment it started. I sat down. She pulled a manila envelope out of the tote and slid it across the table. The first document was a petition, filed 6 days ago in probate court. Petitioner, my brother Elliot, and his wife, Sandra. Respondent, me. The filing alleged that I was, and I'm using the court's language here, demonstrably unfit to manage my own financial and personal affairs due to what they described as a pattern of erratic decision-making, social withdrawal, and deteriorating professional judgment. They had attached a 14-page exhibit. I turned to it with hands that were steadier than I had any right to expect. The first photograph was from my mother's memorial service. I was standing outside the reception hall with my coat half on, my hair coming out of its clip, eyes unfocused and red. The caption under the photo read, "Respondent exhibiting signs of dissociation and inability to function in social settings." Witnessed by multiple attendees. I remembered that moment. I remembered exactly what had happened 30 seconds before that photo was taken. Sandra had found me in the hallway as I was stepping outside to get air. She had looked at me with those soft, concerned eyes and said, "Oh, Jess, you're not doing okay, are you? We're also worried about you." And I had broken, just for a minute. I had let my guard down and cried in front of her because she was family, and I was grieving, and I thought that was safe. She had taken the photo while I was composing myself. I hadn't seen her do it. I hadn't even heard a shutter sound. The second exhibit was a log. 17 missed or rescheduled appointments over 8 months. Client meetings I had allegedly no-showed. A call with our mother's financial advisor that I had supposedly hung up on mid-sentence. A filing deadline I had blown entirely, which had resulted in a late penalty. I stared at the filing deadline entry. I remembered that deadline. I had set 3 separate reminders. I had even called the firm's paralegal 2 weeks out to confirm, and then the morning of the deadline, I had woken up to find the reminder had been moved in my phone's calendar, not deleted, moved to the following Thursday, as if I had done it myself in my sleep. I had apologized to the paralegal. I had paid the penalty out of pocket. I had spent 2 weeks convinced I was genuinely losing my grip. Harriet, I said. Someone changed that reminder. She nodded slowly. I know. She reached back into the tote and pulled out a second folder. This one had a sticky note on the front in her handwriting. IT audit. Shared accounts. My mother had set up a shared family calendar years ago. One of those old school sync setups she'd never gotten around to updating. Everyone's birthdays, holidays, family dinners, all in one place. When she died, none of us had touched it. It felt wrong to delete it. Elliot had still had admin access. He'd had it for years. The audit showed 41 edits made to my personal calendar from a device registered to Elliot's home network. Over 8 months. Appointments moved. Reminders deleted. One meeting rescheduled to a date that didn't exist. February 30th, so it simply never triggered an alert. Another moved to 6 a.m. on a Sunday, which I had slept through and never known I'd missed. He hadn't been watching me fall apart. He had been building the fall. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. I want to know how far this one travels. I want to stop here for a second and explain something, because when I tell people this part of the story, they always ask the same question. Why? We weren't talking about a massive estate. My mother had not left behind a dynasty. She'd left a house, some savings, and a piece of land outside of town that had been in our family for 3 generations. Nothing that would make the news. But Harriet slid one more sheet across the table, and I understood. It was a development offer from a real estate group that specialized in converting rural parcels into mixed-use commercial properties. The offer was for the land, 214 acres that my mother had always called the back 40, even though it was considerably more than 40. She'd grown up on it. Her parents had worked it. It had been sitting idle for years, and I had been paying the property taxes on it without complaint because it felt like the last piece of her I hadn't let go of yet. The offer was for $4.2 million. I was the trustee. The land couldn't be sold without my signature, and if I was declared legally incapacitated, the court would appoint a conservator to act in my place. The petition had already suggested one, a professional fiduciary firm that Harriet told me, very quietly, had a pre-existing relationship with the same development group. This wasn't a family worried about their sister. This was a liquidation plan. I closed the folder. I pressed my palms flat on the table. I thought about every conversation I'd had with Elliot over the past 8 months. Every time he'd looked at me with that particular brand of concern that felt like kindness but left me feeling smaller. Every time Sandra had gently suggested I was taking on too much, that I needed rest, that maybe I should see someone. They had been narrating a story about me, slowly, patiently, and they had been narrating it to everyone who would listen. How did you find out? I asked. Harriet hesitated. The paralegal at the filing firm. She recognized your name. We went to law school together. She called me the same day it crossed her desk. One phone call. One woman who knew my name and made one phone call. That's the margin between losing everything and not. I told Harriet I needed an hour. She said she'd wait. I went to my home office and opened my laptop. I knew what I was looking for, and it didn't take long to find it. Elliot had been sloppy, or maybe arrogant because he hadn't bothered to cover the access trail. The audit log was still there in plain view if you knew where to look. I took screenshots. I documented the IP addresses, the timestamps, the edit history. I cross-referenced every deleted reminder with every appointment I'd been blamed for missing. 41 edits, 41 manufactured failures. Then I opened social media. I don't know what made me look. Maybe I just needed to see the whole shape of it. Elliot had posted 3 days ago, a vague, heavy-hearted update. Some family situations require really hard decisions. We're doing what we can for someone we love. Please keep us in your thoughts. The comments were full of people I'd known my whole life telling him he was a good brother, that it must be so hard, that they were praying for the whole family. Sandra had posted something similar, softer, more emotional, a photo of the two of them looking tired and worried, with a caption about how love sometimes means making choices the other person isn't ready to understand. I sat with that for a minute. There's a particular kind of cruelty in being framed as someone who needs saving. It's airtight. It recruits empathy as a weapon. If you fight back, you look unstable. If you cry, you look like you're confirming the diagnosis. If you stay quiet, the story fills itself in without you. They weren't just trying to take the land. They were trying to take my ability to be believed. I closed the laptop and went back out to Harriet. I said, "Tell me what we're working with." She almost smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. 3 days later, there was a knock at my door at 11:30 at night. I almost didn't answer. I'd been operating in a kind of controlled, methodical fear since Harriet's visit, careful about what I said and to whom, moving quietly, not tipping anything over. I checked the peephole and saw my niece, Cora, Elliot's daughter, 18 years old, a freshman at state school 2 hours away. She was standing on my porch in a university hoodie with her backpack on, her arms wrapped around herself, and she looked like she'd been crying since approximately Thursday. I opened the door. She didn't say anything for a second, just looked at me like she was checking to make sure I was real. I drove here from school, she said. I told Mom I was staying at a friend's. I needed to talk to you and I didn't know how else to do it. I brought her inside, made her tea, sat across from her at the kitchen table and waited. Dad had me sign something, she said finally. Her voice was doing that thing voices do when someone is trying very hard not to cry. Like a month ago. He said it was for your protection, that you'd been struggling, and he just needed something on paper in case things got worse. I didn't read the whole thing. He said it was just a character statement. I kept my face calm. What did it say? She pulled her phone out and showed me a photo she'd taken of the document before she signed it. I don't know why she'd photographed it. Instinct, maybe. The good kind that you don't always understand until later. It was an affidavit, stating that she had witnessed me, on 2 separate occasions, behave in ways consistent with cognitive impairment, that I had forgotten her name at a family gathering, that I had seemed confused about where I was. None of it had happened. I didn't understand what I was signing, she said. And then, last week, I overheard them talking, Mom and Dad, about timelines and the developer and how once the court order came through, they could move fast. And she stopped, pressed her lips together. I heard Dad say he needed to make sure I didn't change my story. And then I started thinking about what story I'd even told. And I went back and looked at the photo I took and she set her phone face down on the table. I'm sorry, Aunt Jess. I'm so sorry. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. She was shaking, this kid. 18 years old and shaking in my kitchen because she had done something brave and terrifying, and she didn't even have a word for it yet. You didn't do anything wrong, I told her. You were manipulated by someone who was supposed to protect you. That's not the same thing. She looked up at me. Are you going to be okay? I told her yes. And in that moment, sitting across from this girl who had driven 2 hours in the dark to warn me, I realized the thing I was fighting for had changed shape. I had been fighting for the land, for my mother's memory, for my reputation. Those things still mattered. But this kid was sitting in front of me having just learned that her father had used her as a tool, that her signature had been a line item in a plan to destroy her aunt. She was going to have to carry that. And the way she carried it depended in part on what happened next, on whether she watched cruelty win or watched it get answered. I wasn't just her aunt anymore. I was the only adult in her life right now who wasn't lying to her. You said you have a photo of the affidavit, I said. She nodded. Send it to me. She did. Then I said, is there anything else you heard? Anything at all? She chewed her lip, thought for a second. There was one night about 2 weeks ago. I wasn't supposed to be home. They were in Dad's office and I could hear them through the door. The guy from the development company was there. They were talking about a timeline, and Sandra kept saying they had to move before you hired anyone. Before I hired anyone, I repeated. Yeah. She said they had a 6-week window and they couldn't afford to wait. 6 weeks. They had a 6-week window before I could lawyer up, find the audit trail, and blow the whole thing open. And they'd spent a month of it already, which meant they were running short on time, which meant they were going to push. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. I called Harriet at midnight. She answered like she'd been awake anyway. Here's the thing about probate court that most people don't know. The petitioner carries the burden of proof. They have to show a preponderance of evidence that the respondent is actually demonstrably impaired, not just unreliable, not just occasionally forgetful, actually unable to manage their own affairs. Harriet had been building the counter case for 3 days. She had the calendar audit. She had the IP logs. She had the affidavit Cora had signed. And now she had Cora herself, willing to testify that the signature had been obtained under false pretenses and that the events described in it had never occurred. That alone was enough to get the petition thrown out on evidentiary grounds. But I didn't want to just get it thrown out. I wanted to understand the full shape of what they built, so I knew exactly what I was dismantling. The development company, I learned, had given Elliot a $50,000 consulting fee 6 months ago, right around the time the calendar edits started. He hadn't disclosed it to anyone. He was supposed to be a co-trustee of our mother's estate, a limited role, more ceremonial than functional, something she'd done so he'd feel included. But the fee created a conflict of interest that voided his standing to petition on the estate's behalf entirely. $50,000. That's what he'd taken to start building the case against his own sister. Harriet also found the development contract, pre-signed on Elliot and Sandra's end, contingent on title transfer within 90 days of the conservatorship order. The developer had already moved funds into escrow. The whole thing was in motion. They hadn't just planned this, they had sold something they didn't own yet, which meant that if the petition failed, they weren't just embarrassed, they were liable. The morning of the hearing, I wore my mother's watch, the one she'd worn every day for 30 years, a plain silver thing with a small face that she bought herself the year she started her business. I don't know why I put it on. I think I needed to feel like she was watching. I let Harriet do most of the talking. I sat straight. I kept my face neutral. I handed over the evidence when asked. The calendar audit, the IP logs, the consulting fee disclosure, Cora's revised statement, 41 documented edits to my personal calendar traced directly to a device registered to Elliot's home address spanning 8 months. Elliot's attorney tried to reframe it as a shared family account. Harriet pointed out that shared access to a family calendar does not grant permission to edit another person's private professional appointments. She said it so cleanly that even the judge looked slightly amused. The petition was denied. The conflict of interest voided Elliot's standing. The undisclosed consulting fee was referred for a separate review. The developer, who had not known about the audit trail or Cora's testimony, filed suit against Elliot and Sandra within 10 days of the hearing for misrepresentation and failure to deliver on the contract terms. The escrow funds were frozen. Lawyers got involved. And then more lawyers. I'm told it got expensive fast. I don't take pleasure in that exactly. But I don't lose sleep over it either. A few weeks after the hearing, Cora texted me. Short message. How are you doing? I told her I was okay. I asked how she was holding up. She said it was weird at home, that things were quiet in a way that felt heavy, that she didn't know what to say to her dad, and she wasn't sure he knew what to say to her. I told her that was okay, that she didn't have to have the right words yet, that she'd done something genuinely brave when she drove to my house in the middle of the night, and that no amount of family awkwardness changed that. She sent back a single emoji, a small, shy-looking one, like she was still figuring out if she was allowed to feel okay about any of it. I drove out to the land the following weekend, just to see it. 214 acres of overgrown field and tree line and one old fence that needed replacing. My mother had always talked about restoring it someday, turning the lower section back into working farmland. She had notebooks full of plans she never got far enough down the road to execute. I stood at the edge of the property and looked at the tree line and thought about what she would have said about all of it. She would have been furious. She would have been devastated. And then, after a while, she would have gotten quiet and said something practical, like, "So what are you going to do with it now?" That's the thing about legacy. It doesn't maintain itself. You have to decide, over and over, that it's worth protecting. And sometimes that decision costs you something. A relationship. A version of your family you thought you had. The comfortable story you've been telling yourself about who people were. I lost some of that. I'm still losing pieces of it, honestly, in the slow, quiet way that grief works when it's not acute anymore, but it's also not done. But the land is still there. The tree line is still there. The tree line is still there. And Cora texts me sometimes now, just to check in. And I always text back. Not every inheritance is worth what it costs you to keep, but some things are. You know the difference when you're standing in the middle of them, looking at what someone tried to take, thinking, not today, not this, not for me. I think about Elliot a lot, not in the way I used to, not with the warmth of someone thinking about a sibling, more the way you think about a thing that almost happened to you, a near miss, a version of your life that got close enough to touch before it didn't. What he built was patient. That's the part that still gets me. It wasn't a moment of anger or a bad decision made in a panic. It was 8 months of quiet, deliberate work. Moving reminders by an hour. Deleting alerts. Planting events I'd never agreed to. 41 separate edits, each one small enough to be invisible on its own, each one designed to make me look like I was losing my grip. He didn't just want the land. He wanted me to doubt myself so thoroughly that by the time anyone looked at me, they'd already see someone who couldn't be trusted with her own life. That's a particular kind of intelligence, and I won't pretend otherwise. It took real effort and real patience, but intelligence without honesty eventually turns on itself. Every system built on a lie has a load-bearing wall that was never designed to hold weight. Elliot's was the calendar audit trail he forgot to clean up. Harriet's law school contact who recognized my name. Cora, who photographed a document before she signed it on instinct. She probably couldn't even explain. He built something elaborate and left the door unlocked. I've thought a lot about what made the difference, and it wasn't luck, not entirely. It was that I didn't collapse when the evidence arrived. I sat down, I looked at the numbers, and I treated it like a problem with a solution instead of a verdict about who I was. That took something I'm not sure I would have had 5 years ago. A kind of steadiness that I think only comes from having been wrong before, having recovered, and knowing the shape of your own resilience. Cora taught me something I didn't expect. She's 18. She signed something she didn't fully understand because an adult she trusted told her it was fine. And then, when something felt wrong, she drove 2 hours in the dark to fix it. Nobody coached her on that. Nobody told her what the right thing was. She just knew, somewhere underneath the fear, and she did it anyway. That kind of moral instinct in a person that young doesn't happen by accident. It gets built, or it gets buried, depending on what they're shown. That's the thing about the people around us. We are always teaching something, whether we mean to or not. Elliot taught Cora, without intending to, exactly what dishonesty looks like from the inside, what it sounds like through a closed door. And she rejected it. She chose something harder and more uncertain, because it was true. I don't know what happens to a person who spends 8 months engineering someone else's unraveling and then watches it all come apart in a courtroom. I don't know what that does to you. I genuinely don't. But I know what it taught me. The cost of protecting something you love is sometimes losing the version of your family you thought you had, and that's a real loss. I'm not going to dress it up. What I have instead is a piece of land my mother loved, a niece who texts me on Tuesday afternoons for no reason, and the knowledge that when it mattered, I didn't let someone else's story about me become the truth. That's not nothing. On most days, it feels like everything.